Hi everyone, my name is Evan Weiss and I'm a sales engineer here at Retool. I'm back with another video in my series of Twilio custom component videos. This time we'll be looking at how you can embed Twilio Conversations SDK into a Retool app to support bi-directional messaging with an SMS client. By the way, I got some feedback on my last video on the Twilio dialer that folks couldn't find the source code for the app. So if you'd like to follow along as we're going through the video, head on over to the App Exchange at tinyurl.com/retool-twilio-conversations. You can find instructions on how to set up this app and all the source code we're going to review there so you can follow along as you watch the video. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the agenda. So we're going to go through a demo of how the app works. We're then going to talk about the Twilio APIs that support the app. We'll spend a lot of time on the Twilio Conversations custom component. That's how we're going to embed the Conversations SDK in our Retool app. And finally, we'll spend some time looking at some common design patterns for working with custom component models. Now, one thing you'll notice is not in this agenda is any discussion of Retool broadly and what it's for. By the way, it's for quickly building front ends for your internal apps. And we're not going to talk about the basics of custom components. This video assumes that you already have that knowledge. If you don't, check out my video on embedding a Twilio dialer in your Retool apps where I cover those topics in more detail. Without further ado, let's get into the demo. So this is our Twilio Conversations app, and the goal of this app, again, is to make it possible to send and receive messages with an SMS client. This is something that might come up if you're building, for example, like a call center or a communication center, a customer service portal, and you want to equip your agents with the ability to talk to customers via SMS. So to use out the app, I'm going to go ahead and type in my phone number. We'll go ahead and submit that so I can send text messages to myself, and we'll go ahead and say, hi there, welcome to the demo. And that's going to show up coming in iMessages over here. You can see I'm using a Twilio trial account, so we have that text in here. This wouldn't be present with a real version of Twilio. But I'll go ahead and respond back and say, happy to be here. And we'll go ahead and add a little bit of emoji in there to give us some flair. So really happy, going to use the eyebrows raised emoji. That's going to show up here. You'll see we do have emoji support. And then I'll respond back and say, let's get to it. And again, want to add some emoji in here. So we'll do our emoji keyboard and add in ta-da. There we go. So this is the basic functionality of the app. We're going to spend the rest of the time talking about how this is made possible using custom components in Retool. So as we dive into the app, the first thing we're going to do is go through the APIs and the way that the Twilio Conversation service is able to communicate with the application. So I'm going to hop into the builder interface for my app. We're now in the Retool builder. And what I want to do is, again, I'm going to go through the process of connecting. But before I do that, I want to show you a couple of the API requests that are involved. So the first thing we'll look at is the way that we set up this whole system. What we want to do to start off with is get a chat token. A chat token is an access token that is created by a Twilio serverless function that gives us information that we need to authenticate with the Twilio Conversations service. So what I'm going to do here is make a request to this endpoint. This is an endpoint that I set up in my Twilio account. It's very similar to the process of setting up voice access tokens, which I covered in detail in the Twilio dialer video, so I'm not going to go through that here, but the instructions for getting this set up are in the repository I shared earlier. So if we run this query, we'll see that what we get back is an access token. This access token is a JSON web token, and this is necessary to initialize a Twilio Conversations client. So what we need to do is actually pass this token into the component model. And you'll see, in fact, that's what we're doing here. So on the success handler of the get chat token, we are going to update the Twilio Conversations custom component model, and we're going to push in that chat token information. So this is how our component is going to get access to that information, and we'll go over that in just a sec. The next thing we want to do is actually do some work to initialize the application by clearing out all of the past conversations that we might have created. One of the things about Twilio Conversations that is important to know is that you cannot attach the same SMS participant to multiple conversations at the same time. Makes sense, right? How would Twilio know where to route those messages? So we need to do some work to get all of the conversations that are in progress and then delete them before we can start using the app. So this is a two-step process. We have a query to get conversations, which we'll do here, and you'll see that we're using the Twilio Conversations API. This is actually one of the built-in connectors that we have, and I'll show you what that looks like briefly. So if you were to go into create a new resource, you'll see that we have generic REST API GraphQL connectors, but we also have a Twilio connector, and this is an open API connection, which is how we have access to all of these awesome operations. So this Twilio Conversations API request, we're just going to run it, and it will get back all of the conversations that are currently active. Then what we want to do is delete all of those conversations. And you'll see that this is another operation supported by the Twilio Open API. We can delete conversations by passing in a conversation SID. And you'll notice if we go back to get conversations that each of the conversation objects we retrieved has a conversation SID. So our task would now be to iterate through each of the conversation SIDs that's present in this response. In this case, you can see there are 2 of them, and delete them before we can start using the app. So in order to do that, we actually need to use some JavaScript to handle this and kind of pass information from one request to another. So I'm going to show you how that works. So what you'll see here is we have some initialized JavaScript. And what it does is it starts out by getting conversations. You'll see this getConversations.trigger is a method that we can use to run the getConversations query. And the response that we get back will set as the value of this data constant. That's going to be the response that we got back from the API. So it's going to contain that list of conversations that we can now iterate through. So the next thing we're going to do is go through and build up a list of all of the conversation SIDs. So this is a map function. It's going to iterate through all of those objects in the conversations array. And we're going to get back for each conversation, each of the conversation SIDs in an array. The next step is to iterate through that array and trigger the delete conversations method for each of those conversation SIDs. And you're going to see a pattern here that might be new to you, which is to use additional scope. This is a way to actually pass specific information into a query that you want to trigger in Retool. So in this case, we're going to pass in a single additional scope key. This is going to be a SID, and the value is SID that we're iterating on in this loop. And so you can see what's going on here. When we go to delete conversations, we're passing in a dynamic key here that's SID, but you'll see it's not defined. And that's because it doesn't become defined until we trigger this query in the context of the JavaScript query that we're using to initialize the app. So that's how we are able to now delete out all of the pending conversations. Then we can get a chat token because we want to wait to do that until we've started to clear out all of this stuff. And then finally, we can tell the Twilio Conversations custom component that we've cleared out all conversations and we're ready to move forward. And then there's a couple of things we're going to do here to control the visibility of UI components so that users don't accidentally interact before the whole app is ready. And this takes a little bit of time. Normally you'd want to do this on the server side. Like in this case, it takes 3.7 seconds to initialize. That's not great for a first load experience, but we're doing it all client side to make this a little bit easier and more compact. So that is how we are setting up the Twilio APIs, getting everything ready to go. The next thing that we're going to do is add a participant to the conversation. And the conversation is going to be initialized by the custom component, so I'll show you that next. But suffice to say, there is an API request that we need to make to add participants. We're going to fire off this API call as soon as we have hit the submit button here to add the phone number. And in fact, you can see there's an event handler on that button that is going to govern that behavior. So on click, we're going to call the add participants and trigger that. All right. The other thing we're going to do when we click submit is we are going to pass the customer number into the custom component model so that we can use it later. And then finally, we're going to set the message input to blank. So if we add a new number, it's going to remove any text that's in this message input box. All right, so that's all of the APIs that we need to call directly through the Retool app. Again, to recap quickly, we need to get conversations and delete them. We need to get a chat token and pass that to the custom component. And we also need to add a participant in response to a user submitting their phone number. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Twilio Conversations component itself, because this is doing a lot of work behind the scenes to create a conversation, to add participants, and to send and receive messages with the Conversations service. So like we talked about before, a Twilio, or rather a Retool custom component, is composed of two main things. There's going to be code in an iframe that causes all the business logic to happen, and there's going to be a model which enables passing data back and forth between the custom component and the outer app. And for ease of understanding in this app, I've actually displayed the custom component model, the current state of it, here in this JSON Explorer component. So you can see exactly what's going on. But if you're curious about where this lives, in the State Manager, we could take a look at the Twilio Conversations custom component. And you can see that it has a key for model, and then this is all the information that we're displaying here. This is the thing that allows us to pass information back and forth to the custom component. So you can see that at this point, the component has started up. It's got a token. It's successfully initialized, and it's even created a conversation SID. But let's take a look at how the app uses all that information. So what I'm going to do now is hop into VS Code. This is in fact the same information that is inside of Retool right now, but it's easier to read here, which is why I'm doing this. So let's walk through what this component is doing. So the first thing you'll notice is that the custom component has a much more complex model than our Twilio dialer if you watch that video. There's a lot more going on here and a lot more information that's passed in and out, but this documentation should help you understand all the keys that might exist. First, what we're going to do in the app is initialize the Twilio Conversations SDK, and we can load that in from their content delivery network, their CDN, and then initialize it for our app to use. So the main thing that this app is going to do is taking place inside of this window.retool.subscribe function. This function is going to get evaluated whenever the underlying model for this component gets updated. So when information is added or removed, or it mutates in any way, it's going to trigger this function to run. And so everything that we're doing in this app is basically inside of this function. There's really not much logic that exists outside of it. And each of these blocks is going to be a conditional that looks at the state of the model and then takes some action based on that. So this window.retool.subscribe function is going to pass a model. This is actually the value of the model that's defined in Retool. It's going to pass that through to all of the code inside of it. So the first thing we're going to do is determine if we need to create a new Twilio Conversations client. That is the object that we're going to use to add participants, to send and receive messages. Really everything else we need to do relies on there being an initialized client in the application. So what we'll do is say, hey, is there a token on the model? Remember, that's the access token that we passed in from getChatTokens. We'll also say, is the client initialized? And finally, have we cleared out the conversations from that first run experience? We need to make sure all of those things are true before we can create our own client. If that is true, then we'll go ahead and create a client using the new Twilio Conversations constructor, and we'll pass in the token off of the model, which is required to initialize the client. The next thing we're going to do after creating the client is set up some event handlers that we can use to tell whether or not the client's successfully initialized. So we'll say on the state change event, take a look at the state object. If the state's failed, then go ahead and update the window retool model. This is how we're now going to push information back into the model to say, hey, the client failed to initialize. So we can then display that in the UI, in the Retool UI. And if it was successful, then we'll go ahead and push the status of success in. Next, we're going to check to see, and again, this is evaluating each time the model updates, has a customer number been passed in from the form where we collected it? And so the way we'll figure that out is, hey, is a client defined? And is there a customer number on the Retool model? And finally, is there an inbound listener for messages coming in from that connection? And if there is not, then what we're going to do is set up a event handler for on client add. If a message is added to the conversations client, then we're going to pass that message in and take some actions. And we're going to say, hey, if the message that was added to the conversation, which is going to happen regardless of who added the conversation, so whether it was coming in from the customer, whether the agent was typing it in the chat window, we want to see how we process this message already. So we'll check to see, is the author of the message the customer? Is it that SMS? And is the message that's coming in different from the current message, right? Because we want to make sure it's actually updated. We don't reevaluate it over and over again and spam the chat. If that happened, then we'll go ahead and push the inbound message that the chat received. We're going to push that back out to the Retool model so that we can then display it in the chat window. And so that's how we're going to do that here with the model update. So we'll update that inbound message, set that as the inbound key. Then, if the client's initialized and no conversation's been created yet, and I'm actually realizing this is a little bit out of order, we should be doing this before anything else, but it's okay because we check to see if a conversation was set up up here, I believe. That's right. Yep. So what we do is we say, hey, if the client is initialized but there's no conversation yet, then we're going to go ahead and create a conversation using this create conversation constructor. And then once that's done, we're going to join the conversation. That basically just means that this SDK is now attached to the conversation and is able to send and receive messages. And we then update the app to say, hey, there's a conversation that's been created. Incidentally, the reason why this is all safe, even though we're not checking to see if a conversation's been created up here, it's not actually possible to add a customer number in the outer app until it sees that there is a conversation SID that's been set. So that's why that's safe. There's some checking that's going on, that logic there. And then finally, the last step is to say, if we have initialized the client and conversations, and there is an outbound message on the model, that means that somebody's typed into the chat window and we're now sending it out, go ahead and send that message by using the send message method on the conversation object and passing the outbound message. So that's everything that's going on in this inner app to make this all work. Now, a couple of things I want to touch on about what's going on inside of the app before we move on to some general ways that we want to work with this component. So you'll notice that we talked a lot about passing messages in and out and how they get rendered in this chat window is something we haven't touched on yet. So I'm going to go ahead and put my phone number in. We can try this out briefly. So you'll notice that when we are sending and receiving messages, well, it looks like there's actually a binding for this already. So I'm just going to reset. That's probably because I was doing the demo in the other window. Again, this gets a little tricky if you haven't deleted past conversation, which is something you would want to do server side typically. But let's go ahead and, again, register our phone number with the conversation. So we'll do that now. We'll submit. And once we've connected, then we can send a message, and we'll send that outbound. And then we can respond with an inbound message, doing this off screen now. And so what's going on here is we have this list view component that is rendering messages, and it's rendering them based on the value of this message history, which is a local storage variable. It's actually a temporary state variable in Retool. So temp state variables are great when you want to store information that's available in the app state that's not on a particular query. And so if we were to look at this, you can see there's a temp state variable in here for message history. And then when we send an outbound message, so we'll look at what happens if we were to enter some text, you'll see that this outbound message input, when we press enter, it triggers this add outbound to history JavaScript query. And that is a JS query that we can see down here, which essentially will take a look at the value of that message input. It will push the message into the Twilio Conversations custom component model. That's how the inner custom component gets access to that information. And then it will get the current value of that temporary state variable, which has all the conversation history, and then push the current message onto that temp state and reset it. So that's how we're able to get this running log of message history. It's actually maintained in a temporary state variable, and then we can then insert it into this list view. Now, this list view is doing a lot of fancy CSS to make these messages look like Apple iMessage. I actually lifted this styling off of the internet, and this is a good reminder for me to put credit for that here in the comments for the CSS, so I'll do that in just a moment. But what you can see here is that each of these items in the list view is an HTML component. I'm defining the HTML in here so you can see the message value. This contains both the message value and the direction. There's a different class applied based on if it's an inbound or an outbound message. And then all the styling to make this look right is here in this custom CSS. So again, I'm going to give credit for the awesome person who figured out how to style these things like iMessage. I certainly am not that good with CSS, but that's how that works. So that's a lot on custom components and how the basic communication works with the component. Finally, the last thing I want to do is talk about some common design patterns when working with custom component models. And the reason this is necessary is that unlike the Twilio dialer custom component, which I showed previously, where you make a connection with WebRTC, and then the outer app doesn't need to do anything else based on information coming back into the custom component. With a chat component, there's a lot of bi-directional communication that's going on. Incidentally, if you're interested in the underlying technology that makes this possible, the Twilio Conversations SDK is opening a WebSocket connection from the browser into the Twilio Conversations service. And that WebSocket connection is constantly receiving and sending data, which means we have to pass information out of the custom component into the outer Retool app and then tell the Retool app, hey, there's new information available on this component. You should render it in the chat window. Doing that actually is kind of a non-trivial pattern in Retool because there's no great event handler defined on custom components that says, hey, some state changed in the model, trigger some update. Like unlike, for example, a query would have success handlers. When the query runs successfully, do something. Custom components don't have that. So if you were to look at this custom component, for example, you will notice it has a model, it has iframe code, it has a bunch of permissions, it has no event handler section. So the question now becomes, when I get an inbound message coming from the client, like this, new inbound message is coming in, how does that information get from the custom component model and get triggered into be rendered in this chat window? Well, the secret that I want to show you here is that you can use a kind of a little known feature in Retool, which is called query JSON with SQL. This is an interesting feature which is designed to allow you to use something called AlaSQL or AlaSQL, or I don't know how you pronounce this thing, but it's this programming language that lets you take a JSON object and query it like it were SQL. So you can do like select star from JSON object where, and then have your filters and do group bys. And it's actually really convenient for folks that are familiar working with databases, but maybe not as much with how you do those things with functional programming in JavaScript. But one really nice thing about the query JSON with SQL resource, and this is again accessible in the resource list, is that unlike a custom component, it actually has success handlers that you can attach to it, and it has the setting where you can run this query automatically whenever inputs change. So you can see what's going on in this query is actually kind of an interesting hack. We're saying, I want to select star from the custom component model .inbound. That's the key that has the inbound message on it. And so if I run this query, you'll see that, it brings back information that's kind of garbage here, right? Like we're just getting the string with all these letters, but that's okay. We actually don't need to use this data for anything. All we need to do is control the timing of when we should run our add inbound to history message, which is the JavaScript function that we run to grab information off of the model. So we can say here, for example, the last inbound message, this is coming from a custom component, and then here's our new inbound message, and this is coming from that custom component model. So again, a little bit of a hack here, but a very common design pattern when you want to understand when something has changed in the state of a custom component model, and then take some action based on that trigger. So you'll notice that we're actually doing that in a couple of other places in this app. The other one is for emoji selection. And the reason we need to do that is because this emoji picker is a custom component. So I haven't talked at all about this yet, but briefly I'll show you what's going on here. This custom component is a lot more straightforward. So we are initializing this awesome emoji picker that was produced by Nolan Lawson. Go check Nolan Lawson out on GitHub. And you can see there's really not much going on here. We're basically just initializing the emoji picker by putting it in a particular spot in our HTML. And then we're setting up an event handler that says when a emoji is picked by being clicked, then we're going to update the window.retool.model update that custom component model with the emoji that was selected. So if we were to take a look at, again, our model browser, here's the emoji picker custom component. Here's the model. If I click on an emoji, you'll see that model updates with the picked emoji. But again, the question is, how does the Retool app know that that's happened so it can now inject that emoji into our input field? Well, again, we're going to use the query JSON with SQL resource type, and we'll say listen for emoji select by saying select star from emoji picker custom component.model.emoji. And when that successfully triggers, because there was an update, we're going to set the value of message input to whatever is currently in there plus the new emoji. So we'll just append it at the end of the string. And then we'll refocus that message input so that people can keep typing without clicking back in it again. So again, a little bit of a hack, but really, really useful. There's a lot of times where you're going to want to use this design pattern with custom components where something in the model updates, you want to take some action. All right, we've gone through a tremendous amount of content here. Thanks for sticking with me. Hopefully this has given you some ideas about how to do much more complex embedding with Retool custom components. Again, I'd encourage you, if you want to get this up and running in your environment, head on over to the Retool App Exchange. You can find the app source code and really detailed instructions on how to set everything up over at tinyurl.com/Retool-Twilio-Conversations. Again, tinyurl.com/Retool-Twilio-Conversations. And that's all we've got for today. Thanks so much for sticking through this to the end, and I really hope you enjoyed the video.